Okay, we're going to start. I'm so excited. This is going to be the most fabulous thing I do today. So, thank you guys, welcome to all. Please let us know you are here in the chat. That'll be our source of introductions today. After the core briefing, if you have questions or comments, use the raise hand function. I will call on you. When you do speak, please reintroduce yourself so we know who you are before you should. My name is Chris Weiss, and I direct the activities of the DC Environmental Network. I think that's why I'm working. So why are we here? The Clean Energy DC Act, which many of us worked to make it law, requires that the Department of Energy and Environment publish a report assessing whether the building energy performance standards should be revised to a standard based on reducing contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And if so, recommend a method and timeline for doing so, including any statutory changes needed. The purpose of this study is to assess which combination of policy structures, metrics, and compliance pathways would serve as the optimal BEPS policy in the district for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when I say BEPS, I mean Building Energy Performance Standards. I'll say BEPS a lot, though. The report comes up with a number of what DOEE calls feasible combinations of BEPS policy structures, metrics, and compliance pathways based on BEPS policies in other jurisdictions, which is kind of a cool thing. I was thinking that now we have a lot of places to look at to inform what decisions we make. In the report, DOEE recommends moving towards Trajectory Package B, which is a trajectory BEPS policy structure with two metrics: site energy use intensity and on-site greenhouse gas emissions intensity. I am hoping our panel can explain these two concepts fully. However, DOE recommends that any new BEPS policy not become effective until 2032 at the earliest. This would allow DOE to review the impacts of the current BEPS policy after the first BEPS compliance cycle, ending in 2026, complete additional analysis to determine long-term targets for buildings, and conduct extensive stakeholder engagement. Now, we have an excellent panel to explain all this and answer questions, including Katie Bergfeld, Branch Chief, Building Performance and Enforcement Branch, Data and Benchmarking Division at the Department of Energy and Environment. That's a long title. Andrew Held, Data Management and Science Program Manager. And I just told him I want to be a science program manager, but I'm not qualified. He's also with the Department of Energy and Environment. And our very own advocate slash government employee, everything. He's been in many capacities over the last decade. Cliff Majersik, who's the Senior Advisor, Policy and Programs, Senior Advisor for Policy and Programs at Institute for Market Transformation. All three, along with input holders like the BEPS Task Force and others, were involved in creating this report. We will now have our three fabulous panelists explain this report and DOE's recommendations. Katie, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear me, right? Yeah, I just got a low battery notification on my headphones, so I plugged them in, so I'm hoping they're working. I'm going to go ahead and just share PowerPoint, but as Chris said, we don't need this to be super formal, so if you do have questions, I'm okay if you want to pop in and ask or raise your hand, like Chris said. We don't have to wait till the end or anything like that. I also want to preface that I'm going to be the one talking a lot here at the beginning, but Andrew and Cliff were really, Andrew particularly was really kind of the brain trust behind this study. So if there are a lot of sort of questions, I think both of them would be able to answer them much more succinctly than I could. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Can you all see this full screen? Okay, good. Yeah, so basically, as Chris mentioned, so the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2018, which is the law that established the Building Energy Performance Standards Program. So Title III of that bill specifically is what established the BEPS program. That was, again, passed in 2018 by Council, and Council put a provision in there that by January 1st, 2023, that DOE shall publish a report assessing whether the Building Energy Performance Standard should be revised to a standard based on reducing contribution to greenhouse gas emissions? And if so, recommend a method and timeline for doing so. Currently, just to give you all quick context for anyone on the line that's not familiar, I'm guessing you are familiar with our BEPS program, but currently the way that our BEPS program works is that DOE sets a standard every 6 years, starting in January 1st, 2021. And for most building types, the standard is based on your Energy Star score. If you can't get a score, then it's based on your source energy use intensity. And then what happens from there is we sort of look at the buildings, we see if they met that standard. If they didn't meet that standard, they're then required to follow a pathway to increase the efficiency of their building over a 5-year compliance cycle. Specifically, it's kind of predicated on this performance pathway, which is a 20% reduction in site EUI. So the standards are based on an Energy Star score, but then you're measured against, your reduction in site EUI essentially over that compliance cycle. So that's how our current policy is written. And this provision in the law sort of said, okay, the program is an efficiency first program. It's meant to reduce, to get load reduction in our buildings from an energy standpoint. And so we want DOE to kind of look at and see what it would mean to change to more of a greenhouse gas-based metric for the BEPS program. And we want to highlight, because this is a conversation we had with the task force a couple times, this report is just a report. There's currently nothing that's introduced legislatively. There's nothing that's changing right now. And that this is meant to be the start of the discussion. This is not meant to be like, this is what DOE is saying, and this is what has to happen, right? This was a report. This was an analysis that we did. We did some internal analysis, and then we worked with IMT, who's been a great partner to help us kind of analyze different policy scenarios. And so this is just a report, and it's a way for us to start a conversation. So that's why we're here today. I'm going to try to get through this quickly so that we can have that conversation. Not too quickly. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what the study looked at, so we consulted with the Institute for Market Transformation, Cliff is here, the BEPS task force, and then we also talked to some of our agency partners to kind of expand upon the existing analysis framework and incorporate qualitative evaluation of various policy packages. So we looked at this from a quantitative standpoint of Andrew did some analysis of, we looked at different types of policy scenarios and what that would get us quantitatively in terms of greenhouse gas emission savings. But we also had some qualitative, evaluation pieces that we looked at, and I'll talk about those a little bit later, but it was sort of like, how easy is the policy to understand? How easy is it to enforce? What is the equity component of each policy? So that was another piece that we looked at, and IMT was really helpful in us being able to do that. So the study itself is broken into 5 parts. We talked about the components of a BPS policy. We did a description of each of the policy packages that we considered for the study. We did a technical analysis that estimated the predicted energy and GHG savings for each policy package. So that's the quantitative piece. And then we sort of looked at that evaluation criteria that I mentioned. That's more of qualitative piece of it to kind of grade each policy package. And then at the end, we talked through our policy and statutory recommendations, which Chris just summarized, but we can talk about more. So when you're looking at a BPS generally, there's kind of 3 components that you can analyze them from, which is, what we applied to in this study. There's the structure of the policy. So that's kind of what I described of the framework of our BEPS policy. We have Energy Star score. We put you in a compliance cycle. Like that's the framework of our policy, right? And that sets up how the standards are calculated, how the compliance pathways are, what are available to the building owners or whoever is subject to the requirements. Then past that, there's the actual metrics. So what metrics are you using? Again, ours currently uses Energy Star score or source EUI, just at standard, and then you're evaluated based on your reduction in site EUI. Those are the actual metrics that people are looking at. And then there's the different compliance pathways. So for you all on the line, again, our current framework has several different compliance pathways. There's a performance pathway, which again is just a straight 20% reduction in site EUI. DOE has built out a very robust prescriptive pathway. So you also have to look at what those options are going to be when you're designing a BPS as well. This right here shows one of the types of policy packages that we looked at, which is called a recalculated policy structure. And so basically in a recalculated policy structure, you set the BEPS at the start of each cycle. So this is sort of like what our current framework looks like. You set a BEPS at the start of each cycle. The BEPS is established based on the building values from the previous cycle. So whatever gains you make in the first cycle, that sort of determines what the second cycle is going to look like. And it's recalculated. Our current program is recalculated every 6 years, but it could be any number of years. It could be 2 years. It could be 10 years, right? It just, the idea is that you set a standard and then it's sort of recalculated every couple years across the building stock or across the property types in that building stock. So then again, in our program, we set the BEPS, then every 6 years, we reset them. And then buildings are either required to make a 20% reduction or meet the standard. That's how our current policy works. And then in this example, Andrew kind of built out this example to show that the building is in compliance with the first cycle because they reduced their EUI by 20%. And then in the future cycles, it just complies by meeting the standard, which is an option that we currently provide to building owners. They don't have to actually get a full 20% reduction. Andrew, is there anything else I'm missing from like this slide that you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to kind of point, I think you kind of mentioned this, but to iterate, like this is based on our current policy, but we're using site UI here because you can't predict out an energy score out to 2050. Yeah. So we use site UI as a stand-in for a lot of places in the study for Energy Star score, which is both perfect and imperfect.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. So, and like we said, what we're showing in this example is like what happens in our current policy if a building has to get a full 20% reduction and then eventually just meets the standard, right? You can kind of see the jump in the reduction of EUI over time, right? So then this is another type of policy structure that's called a fixed limits policy. And it basically, this is very similar to what, I think this is sort of based on what New York City has, which is they essentially set greenhouse gas intensity limits for each cycle. And I think New York has set theirs out like 10 or 15 years in the future, right, Cliff? So New York kind of did some analysis and they have these limits that you hit every 5 years.
New York's actually goes out beyond 2050.
Okay, so beyond 2050.
But there is still some uncertainty because they haven't set the conversion factors for electricity to greenhouse gases that far out.
Oh, okay, okay. So then you get to that year, they've set a limit, you get to that year, if you're above that limit, you're determined to be out of compliance and you pay some sort of alternative compliance penalty or payment because you kind of are exceeding your limit, essentially. So in this example, the blue line sort of shows that in the first cycle, it's at 3 kilograms per CTOE, you know, the GHG intensity is at 3 basically, and then it steps down to 2, and then it steps down to 1.75. So you can see it sort of steps down over time, and the bars represent the building's greenhouse gas intensity for each year. So the red bars are where the building exceeded that limit. So this is sort of showing one building over time meeting those limits or not meeting those limits. So that's what a fixed limits policy would look like. Now on to what a trajectory approach would look like. So the trajectory policy structure, so just FYI, this is the one that we're recommending. So just so we could explain it, I just want to make sure, you know, if y'all weren't listening before, you might want to listen so you understand this. So the trajectory policy sets a long-term target for each cycle. And then you basically take each building baseline, and then you draw a line from where they're at to where they're supposed to be by that, you know, that endpoint on here. The endpoint, I believe, is 2050, right, Andrew? It's modeled out to be 2050. The endpoint's 2050. So you would set an endpoint at 2050 and say, for office buildings, we want every office building to be at this endpoint. And then your office building, building A, is starting here. And so you need to make a bigger reduction because you're farther away than that endpoint. And so every 5 or 6 years, we're going to check in and we're going to give you a limit that you have to hit in order to get you to that point, right? And so you can see here, these are the different lines represent different buildings. So building A is the one on the top, that's at 120 kb2 per square foot. Building B is at 100 and building C is at 80. Their endpoint is 50. So you can see that building A from 2023 to 2028 has to make a steeper reduction than building B or C because they're starting from a different point. Is there anything you want to add to that, Cliff or Andrew, in terms of what a trajectory approach generally, what that means?
That's great. I have the slide in my deck too, so I can.
Okay.
I think
So
I
these
copied
are-
this from Cliff's deck.
Probably. So these are all the packages that we looked at. The top one is the base package. So that's our current policy. The second one is called the alternative base package A. So essentially this would be our current policy, but you would remove the standard target pathway, which, as I mentioned before, that's like where a building just has to meet the standard. They don't have to do a full 20% reduction in EUI. And then alternative base package B is that we would basically, right now we're required to set the standard at least the median level of energy performance. So right now what alternative base package B models out is that we would set it stricter than the median. So we would maybe go with the 70th percentile or the 80th percentile. Then there's the greenhouse gas limits package, which I showed before, which is similar to New York's policy. And then there's the two trajectory packages that we looked at. One is that there would just be this site EUI target that you'd have to hit, as I mentioned before. And you look at your baseline and draw a line to where you're supposed to hit. And then trajectory package B, which again is the one we're recommending, is that we set these long-term targets. We build out a trajectory approach for each building, but we also add on the phase out of on-site burning of fossil fuels in each building, again, with the goal of it there being 0 by 2050. So 0 combustion fuels on site by 2050. I'm not going to go over all that's in this chart, but that's just like a general overview of the packages that we looked at. We can send these slides out. Y'all can have them. This right here gives you a quantitative view of the savings that you get from each different package. So over here in this column, you'll see the different effective dates that there could be for each. So the way that Andrew kind of built out this analysis is he was looking at our current policy and the kind of 6-year or 5-year cycle that we have right now. And then kind of establishing an effective date of either 2026 or 2032, and then looking at the annual greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the cumulative emissions we would get from each package. So this is just a comparison of the quantitative numbers that he is kind of predicting would come out of each of those packages. And I can leave it here if you all want to look at it a little bit, or I can move on. I see there's a hand up.
As the Climate Commitment Act last year changed the city's compliance to net zero to 2045 instead of 2050,
Yeah.
why haven't you changed your trajectory?
So again, this study is just a study. So this study was built before that. This study, the analysis that Andrew had done was created before that legislation was passed. And so he had based the analysis on the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. And again, we can make an adjustment to all of that if we need to. And if there were to be a trajectory approach, we could have that trajectory approach end in the endpoint be in 2045. Again, this is just an analysis. There's no legislation, there's no requirements right now attached to any of this. You want to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the Climate Commitment Act, yeah, as Nina's pointing out in the chat, was enacted like in the middle of while we were developing this study, and we in kind of adjusting for that, we added this second column, which actually overlays the cumulative emission reduction from each of the policies over our carbon neutrality model, which is a separate study entirely, which looks at more comprehensive carbon neutrality by the district to actually meet that 2045 target. So in overlaying this analysis over the 2045 model and the carbon neutrality study, we kind of arrive at a similar answer to kind of what you're asking there, in that like it shows what each of these packages would get us to in terms of our actual carbon neutrality model. We chose to keep kind of the 2050 goal initially mostly because it was like a neat way to tie a bow on the BEPS program. If we stopped any sooner, we'd stop in the middle of a compliance period, and we wanted to be able to compare these packages to our existing policy. So
That's true.
we tried to, thread that needle there.
Nina has a question.
Hey, Nina.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I was late. I had I'll put my video on so I can be seen. For somebody who, I'm new to carbon accounting, so it would be very helpful for me to, if you don't mind, if I'm the only one, that's okay, I'll do it separately, but if you can explain for the trajectory package B that you're recommending, could you just tell us in kind of lay terms what these two columns mean?
Oh, these two columns.
0.553, 553, and then 3128 and 2225.
Sure.
And then another question is regarding the last question, would speeding it up be a matter of more money put into it at the front end, or is it, to what extent does this depend on funding? Maybe you dealt with that before I came on, or maybe you want to deal with it at the very end of this presentation, that's fine. But if you can just explain these numbers, that would be great.
Andrew, do you want to explain
Yeah.
that since you created
Happy-
this chart?
Happy to. So let's talk with the two numbers you were just pointing out there, Nina. So the first column, which for trajectory package B in 2020, starting in 2026, the annual building emissions in 2050 would be 0.553 megatons of CO2 equivalent. That means that in the year 2050, our existing building population that was looked at for this study will emit in that single year about 500,000 megaton of CO2 equivalent. So that's just the annual emission rate for that year. The cumulative avoided emissions looks at emissions that were not released into the atmosphere as a result of this policy for each year that they were not released. So, for example, there would be some amount of emissions reductions that happen in 2027 and 2028 and 2029 and so on and so forth until we're stopping counting at 2045 here. And so that's just the cumulative of that. So it's saying we are avoiding about 3 million megatons of CO2 equivalent over the course of the lifetime of this policy from our existing building sector. Cliff, you can also probably explain this way better than I can. So I see your hand up as well.
If I understand you, does that mean if you add the two columns, you get what, one is annual, right?
Yeah, so you would have to
So if
basically
you multiply that by the number of years and add it to 0.553, that's what we have sort of now, or in 2026.
not necessarily. What we don't have on this page, and I think we have another chart, is the actual annual emission rate for each year for each policy. And all those added up is how you get to the, the 3.128 number.
That's helpful too. Thanks very much.
Yeah. If you want to go ahead.
I was just going to speak to the second part of Nina's question about what needs to be done to sort of accelerate, and is it just about spending more money? The key thing here is that the big driver of emissions in Washington D.C., as in every other city, is privately owned buildings. Buildings collectively account for more than 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in D.C. Privately owned buildings a little bit smaller in D.C. than other places because we have a big federal government presence, but still. The majority of that, the vast majority of that is privately owned buildings. It takes a lot of money to improve that much privately owned buildings. In New York City, their BEPS is projected to drive $20 billion of investment over the first 10 years of their BEPS policy. And it would be a much smaller number here because DC is smaller than New York, but you're still talking billions. You're not talking millions. So this is what we're going to need is for DC to make a big investment. It's already started in buildings that don't have the resources like affordable housing. And it'll be really key for us as a community to push for more resources for these buildings that don't have resources and that are serving underserved communities, frontline communities like affordable housing. For the big office buildings that are owned by big corporations, they have the capital and they can make value creating investments in their own buildings. So that's not a matter of DC providing the money, that's a matter of DC setting reasonable regulations and expecting them to make these improvements in their own buildings with their own money and reap the benefits of those improvements. And this is just a study, it's already been published, it's not going to be changed. Andrew and Katie have done a fabulous job. I don't think we should be arguing for changing the study, but as Katie has pointed out, we absolutely should be pushing for legislation. I think this study provides a roadmap in the same way that the Clean Energy DC plan provided a roadmap for the Clean Energy DC Act and the original BEPS. So, and absolutely, as Katie sort of alluded to, we can push for a 2045 endpoint on the trajectory instead of 2050. And we don't need for them to revive this study in order to do that. So I think we're in a good place, and I think we should have a more robust conversation about this afterwards. And I just want to also really call out Katie and Andrew, our national models. People, or every jurisdiction around the country wishes they had someone like them, and they are actually, we have 30 some jurisdictions around the country that are actively following DC's lead. So the work that they're doing has huge impact, not just here in DC.
Thanks, Cliff. That was really nice. Sorry, Nina, I just saw your note to slow down, so I'll slow down. I know sometimes when I get excited, I can talk really fast. So I'm really excited about this. Yeah, like to Cliff's point, you see all these years at the bottom of this slide. These are somewhat arbitrary. These are just what Andrew used to model for this study. And he was sort of basing it off our current policy, which is an every 6-year cycle. But this could be every 2 years. It could be every 3 years. It could have an endpoint in 2040. It could have an endpoint in 2045. I think, if legislation were introduced, obviously DOE would want to take a look and see what makes sense from a practical standpoint and, an ability to regulate standpoint, because that's where my mind always jumps. How are we going to regulate that? And so, but these years could be whatever you want it to be, right? It really could. And so the idea here, though, is that each individual building would have their own baseline, and then there would be an endpoint by property type, and then they would be told over time, this is where you need to be. And that's sort of the general structure of what we're recommending, with the addition of phasing out on-site combustion of fossil fuels by a certain point. It could be 2050, it could be 2045. But what was modeled here was 2050. So that's sort of comparing the different policy packages. So then this models out the quantitative, or this compares the quantitative savings you get from each package. And again, we can send these slides out, you all can keep them, and you can obviously ask Andrew and I any questions you have afterwards. This was a slide that the task force asked us to put together. That's very messy. This is why Andrew's shaking his head. This sort of takes these numbers and puts them in a line graph so you can compare them a little bit better to each other. It's a little bit messy because it has all the different colors to it, but it's the same information from here, right, Andrew? It's just in a graph form.
Actually, this is a great place to highlight one of Nina's questions, because this is the representation of every annual emissions factor for each policy. So if you were to take one of these lines and add up each of the numbers, you would arrive at or subtract each of the numbers from the base policy and then add them up, then you would get the 3.1 number.
Yes.
So it's the area under the curve, or between the curves here.
Between the curves.
Yes.
And again, this is just sort of showing you a comparison across the packages. And then the other thing that I mentioned, and IMT was really helpful with this, was kind of a qualitative approach to like how you evaluate a policy. And so we consulted with IMT helped us build it out, and we consulted with several stakeholders. We presented this to the task force and said, what is the most important thing to you for a BPS policy? Like, is it simplicity? Is it that it's fair? Like we kind of asked those questions of them. And we also reviewed a lot of the public comments that were made to us through the BEPS rulemaking process. We got like 200 comments or whatever to that. So we got a lot of feedback there. And so the different things we looked at were how did the different policy structures align with our goals and commitments? We have to, as you all are pointing out right now, we need to make sure that it matches up with our 2045 carbon neutral goal, right? Like, so at the end of the day, this has to align, right? Social and racial equity, regulatory fairness, jobs and economic growth, maximizing certainty was a big one for the regulated community, obviously. Transparency, driving early action. So how much does the policy structure drive people to actually comply early rather than wait till the last minute kind of thing? Accommodate building life cycle events. So that one is sort of like, it should allow building owners flexibility to make improvement at a cost-effective point in the building's life cycle. So for example, our current policy, we did a lot of work with the affordable housing sector because they have a very unique challenge in their refinancing cycles. And so we were able to build in flexibility in our current policy to kind of match up with those to allow flexibility for affordable housing and hold them to the regulations, but still allow them flexibility to meet those requirements, given that they have these unique refinancing cycles. So that's like an example of that. Simplicity, is it easy to understand? I think a lot of people think that our current policy is not very easy to understand. And so we get that feedback all the time. And then the ease of compliance and implementation. So really there should be a minimal effort to demonstrate compliance. So for example, our prescriptive pathway right now is very documentation heavy. It's very rigorous. It's like that for a reason, because we don't want it to be a loophole to performance. But like, for example, that's a compliance pathway that is going to require a lot of soft costs and a lot of documentation and a lot of rigorous review on our part. Whereas our performance pathway is pretty easy. We look at your baseline data in 2019, we look at your performance data in 2026. Was there a 20% improvement? There's just straight math. And for a trajectory approach, that's very similar too, right? You're here, you got to get here. And over time, you have these little milestones you have to hit. It's very straightforward. It's your site energy use intensity, which for any of you on the line that aren't familiar with that term, it's the energy usage you consume on site per square foot. So it's your site energy use intensity over time. It's very straightforward. The other thing that a lot of building owners, like I said, we're bringing up is the idea of certainty. So right now, because our BEPS are sort of reset every 6 years, there's not a lot of certainty for the market. So right now, everyone knows that the BEPS in 2021 for offices was an Energy Star score of 71. We don't know what the BEPS is going to be for 2027. We don't know. And so a lot of building owners are kind of having anxiety about that because, they're trying to, and for good reason. They're trying to make, they're trying to plan their capital upgrades. They're trying to plan budgets, and they need sort of that. They need more certainty and able to be able to do that. And we'll talk about. So this is where we compared all of those, all the packages with those criteria. So you can see here, this is our base package right here, and there's a lot of no's. So this kind of says, looking at this criteria, do we feel like this policy structure meets that criteria, right? Is it adequate? You can see our current policy. There's a lot of good things about our current policy, but we were the first to do it. We have a lot of lessons learned. And so there's a lot of things that we definitely know we need to improve on, and we're aware of that, right? And so the policy that we are recommending, you can see it pretty much hits every single point. There's an asterisk next to social and racial equity because this study specifically didn't look at that. That wasn't kind of within the scope of this study. I think it's something that we should do. I think that is, something that's important to do, particularly if we're going to move to a new policy. That is something we should bake in from the beginning. This study specifically did not look at that. So that's why we kind of put NA across the board. Not that we don't think it's important or, should not be an essential piece of any BPS policy. But you can see here, this trajectory package B sort of hits every single one of those points. And then this again is just an overview, sort of showing you that specific package, so trajectory package B, and kind of showing you the comparison to our base package of the emissions that you're going to get, both on an annual basis and then from a cumulative standpoint. This is, oh, Andrew, can you explain this one a little bit?
Yeah, happy to. Also,
Oh, I see a
hand
hand
up from-
raised.
yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, well, maybe I should have asked this question before. Since Sustainable DC frames it as net zero, what is your evaluation of whether this coincides with real zero or not? I asked the same question regarding transportation sector. I did with the DC Climate Coalition. I really didn't get an answer. So are there offsets involved in this, or in calculating net zero, or what is your sense? That's my basic question.
Yeah, Andrew, so I think that answer your first question, we haven't quite 100% determined what the net zero targets would be for the buildings, but I know Andrew modeled out net zero targets for each property type, right?
I think, well, someone will have to remind me, but it depends on whether we're talking about net zero energy or net zero carbon. Cliff, do you know, did you want to chime in?
I mean, finish your thought.
Okay.
I can pipe in after that.
Okay, so this policy switch, this study doesn't really cover net zero energy. That's a really kind of hard to define, especially in a macro sense out to 2050 or 2045. But in a net zero carbon sense, this aligns pretty closely with what we hope our buildings to perform at in terms of achieving a net zero carbon building stock. I don't know about city. Katie, if you go back to the previous slide, I can kind of talk through this. The graph on the right is the carbon neutrality strategy. The top yellow part is basically the difference between all the strategies recommended in the study and the current business as usual case, which includes our standard BEPS. So you can see everything we're recommending in carbon neutrality does a pretty big chunk of that. The green line is all the same policies, but at an accelerated rate. So the savings are realized earlier, which means our cumulative emissions are larger. The purple line, the purple kind of chunk there, which is a little hard to see, sorry, is the difference between what if we adopted this trajectory approach for our existing building stock. So it knocks off another chunk. You can clearly read the graph. It doesn't get us to zero. I believe carbon neutrality includes some amount of offsets in it. I'm not familiar with the latest version of the study, so they might have revised stuff. This is based off of a working model of carbon neutrality DC that has not been published, or I mean, the final report has not been published. There is public documentation out there. But the thing that I'll highlight about this study and this policy model is that it focuses heavily on phasing out on-site natural gas consumption in our existing building stock. So that, to the greatest extent, is aligned with carbon neutrality in that, all our large buildings will, in 2050, consume no on-site fossil fuels under this policy approach. They'll be required to electrify or fuel switch to a more whatever magic fuel comes up is invented in the interim. And that, coupled with our renewable portfolio standard program, will ensure that our electricity is 100% carbon free. We can argue about the attribution rates of RPSs all day long. But so in that sense, this policy is aligned with carbon neutrality. I would not go as far to say it's aligned with net zero energy as a whole. Cliff.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Andrew just said. I would just say, David, it's sort of implicit in your question is something which I heartily support, which is a healthy skepticism of offsets. There are some real questions around the additionality of offsets and other things. And to DC's credit, every jurisdiction that has a climate neutral plan that I know of includes offsets in their climate neutrality strategy. And that's pretty much scientifically kind of necessary, because with current technology, we don't know how to have big buildings like we have in DC be carbon neutral without something like that. To me, the measure of a neutrality plan, the most important measure is how realistic it is, how concrete is it, and is there the political will to actually follow up on it. But a secondary measure of a carbon neutrality plan is how little offsets that they use. And DC's plan uses relatively little offsets. It uses less offsets than most of our peers. And that's very much to the credit. And further, the offsets are not part of the study that Andrew and Katie are presenting that we worked on. The offsets are part of the carbon neutrality plan. The study that has no offsets at all. Their buildings cannot buy offsets to credit them against their on-site. So that's a real strength. This is focusing on real emissions reductions and not buying offsets somewhere else. And that's actually distinguishes us from some BEPS policies in other jurisdictions that are not as strong.
Yeah. Although I will say that I think if there were, I would say that y'all should be prepared. We all should be prepared that the commercial real estate market is going to ask for that in a policy such as this. I literally just had a conversation for a webinar that I'm going to give on Monday to AOBA, which is a building industry association here in DC, for all of you that aren't familiar with AOBA. And they already are bringing that up. Well, why don't you do what Montgomery County did? Or why don't you do, why don't you provide for offsets and renewables and all of that? So it's definitely a conversation that once, if any conversation about this comes up, is probably going to come up from building owners. So it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they're already sort of asking me about that.
Okay, are we close to the end of your part?
Yep. Yep. So this is just the end. This is the last one. This is kind of just explaining why we chose. We recommend, sorry, we didn't choose. We recommend that package. It saves most energy and avoids the most emissions over time. It meets most of the evaluation criteria that I mentioned before. Building owners have long-term targets that provide certainty. It'll send a clear market signal to phase out fossil fuels, which we think is really important and our current policy kind of lacks. And it sort of ensures electrification is done with energy efficiency in mind still, right? As per this conversation we just had. And that there's a long-term goal setting for each building, and that there's sort of like an off-ramp that you can meet your target early, right? However, as Chris mentioned, we don't recommend implementing these changes until after the first compliance cycle. So after this first compliance cycle has concluded, and that we can do a robust evaluation of kind of where our program is at right now, coupled with stakeholder engagement, so we can conduct that. So we recommend that there be an effective date of 2032. Again, those years are somewhat arbitrary. I'm trying to find that slide, sorry, of 2032. So this bottom piece right here where we say effective date of 2032. And that is it from DOE.
That's a lot, thank you. And you certainly made, well, you moved us a lot in the direction of your proposed alternative here. So go ahead, Cliff. Why don't you share your screen?
Yes. Okay. So I'm unmuted. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So yeah, excellent presentation, Katie and Andrew. Just some sort of background here. So I'll take the blame for the original BEPS, and I was the one that sort of proposed the concept to Councilwoman Committee Chair Che, and so I'm very proud of it. It was a huge step forward. It's been emulated around the country. It was the first ever BEPS anywhere in the country. But knowing what we know now, anytime you do something that's completely novel, completely new to the world, you learn from it. And that's what this represents, is us realizing that as good as our BEPS is, there are lots of opportunities for improvement. And other jurisdictions have copied what we've done and learned from what we've done, and we're learning from what others have done. The trajectory approach is an approach that IMT developed, and we developed it, after having worked with a bunch of different jurisdictions around the country. There are now 38 jurisdictions that are in President Biden's Building Performance Standard Coalition, including DC and the Maryland counties of Prince George's and Montgomery and Annapolis. And I'll show you in a moment a map with it. President Biden announced it in January of 2022, so almost exactly a year ago. And in fact, as sort of part of the celebration of the BEPS coalition, we will be having a webinar on the 26th, next Thursday, talking about BEPS implementation. And actually, my colleagues, James and Rajiv, are on this call. I invite one of them to put into the chat the web address to sign up for that webinar. You all are invited to tune in for that. And I'll actually will have someone from the White House will provide opening remarks as part of that. So would love to have you all there. So, we're working with these 38 governments, including DC, that are part of the BEPS coalition. And here's a map of all of them. You heard about, folks like New York and Boston, California, the whole state of California actually just joined. We need to update this map. I need to update this map. So we have a lot of folks that we can take best practices from. And that's what this study is capturing, is what we've learned working with all of the stakeholders. These are the principles that Katie went through. I won't go through them again, but this guides us as we think about what policy makes sense. And a couple other principles that are added to this from the report are, driving building electrification and harmonization with other jurisdictions, especially neighboring jurisdictions like Montgomery County, which also uses the trajectory approach and site energy use intensity as its performance metric. So, there are broadly three categories of building performance policies, building performance standards, and you can break them up in different ways. But one, as Katie recounted, is what DC has now, which is where you recalculate every 4 or 5 years. DC was the first of all BEPS, and then you have St. Louis and Washington State that followed that model. And it has the problems that Katie mentioned of not having long-term certainty. Then you have the greenhouse gas long-term set value approach that New York City and Boston have. And that has some real problems. Building owners in particular are very upset about the New York model. If you think building owners are not happy with the DC BEPS, you should talk to building owners about the New York law. And then you have the trajectory approach, which is increasingly the direction that jurisdictions are going. So two of the most recent adoptions of building performance standards in Denver and Montgomery County use it. It's based on the IMT model building performance standard law approach. And it's also likely to get used in Colorado, and Chicago's using it as a starting point, Portland, Oregon, a bunch of other jurisdictions that we're working with that are part of the coalition that are writing their building performance standards now. Our model law is based on working with all the jurisdictions that have these, taking the best elements from each of the BEPS and learning from the lessons learned, the opportunities for improvements. It's also, we've worked with equity experts and community-based organizations, environmental groups, building scientists, building owners, everybody that affordable housing providers, everyone that we thought could have expertise to improve it. So, we feel very proud of it. It's a living document. We invite you all to download it from our website. And if you have feedback, we want to hear it. And that feedback isn't just going to go on a shelf somewhere. It's actively being used by all the jurisdictions that are adopting new building performance standards. This is the trajectory approach. Katie went through it. So, if there are questions, I can take them, but I'm not going to go through it again. As Katie mentioned, the recommendation in the report is not just for site energy use intensity, but also for on-site and district thermal greenhouse gas emissions. of the on-site greenhouse gas emissions is basically sending a very clear signal to the market that they need to get to zero fossil fuel in buildings by the final year. And certainty is really what we're striving for here. We don't want any building owners to be under the mistaken impression that it makes any kind of economic sense to take out an old furnace and put in a higher efficiency furnace. We want them to have long-term certainty that no furnace that burns any fossil fuels is going to make economic sense, because they're going to have to meet a final standard well before the end of a lifetime of that furnace. So they should just go now to heat pumps. So that's, a really central element that the current BEPS does not have. Unfortunately, the current BEPS, because you can only see 6 years out, many building owners may mistakenly conclude that they should just put in a higher efficiency boiler or furnace. And so that's an important advantage of this recommendation. And the recommendations, by the way, are on page 62 of the study. So, it's a long study with a lot of good stuff in it, but if you're only going to read one section, I would, skip to page 62 and read from there. So we know that buildings don't improve in straight lines. Building owners know their buildings best. They're going to decide what to do when to improve their building based on, what the physical characteristics of the building are, when the end of life of the equipment. We know when are there tenant turnovers, empty spaces, that it makes it easier for them to make improvements. So this is just one example. In this example, the building owner chooses lighting upgrades, then building tune-up. That gets them good enough to get to the first compliance cycle. And then they make an envelope upgrade that gets them their building's energy use low enough to make it through the second compliance cycle. Then they do a mechanical upgrade, and that gets them all the way to where they need to be for the final performance. That's just an example. Of course, different building owners will choose different measures at different order, but just to sort of illustrate that we don't expect that buildings are actually going to be improving the same amount every year. The recommendation is for sort of 5 years for each compliance cycle, and that matches up pretty well with the capital planning cycles that building owners already have. We need for them to be building into their long-term capital planning cycles. How am I going to improve this building to be part of the solution, to be part of DC accomplishing its decarbonization commitments? And the intention is that this BEPS sends an even stronger signal to the market that they need to do that. They need to build that into their capital plans right now. So the IMT model law actually recommends the two metrics that DC is recommending. I would note that we also recommend 3 other metrics, and that's not covered by the study. And I think that building owners are somewhat reluctant to have more things that they have to comply with for good reason. But we think it makes sense to treat buildings holistically in one law to get all of the things that we want from our buildings. And so the other 3 metrics that are in the IMT model law are coincident peak demands. So trying to minimize how much electricity the buildings are using at the time when the grid is at its greatest strain, when it's at the greatest risk of blackouts. And that will allow us to decarbonize the grid faster at lower cost and with greater reliability. Much less expensive to get buildings to use less energy at peak times than have to build more solar and wind and transmission and distribution and substations to meet that one spike, that one hot summer afternoon when everybody's using their electricity. Also, another metric is water use intensity. We know that DC is blessed with somewhat more abundant water than other areas, but still droughts are very much an issue. And water uses a lot of carbon, the energy used to pump water. And lastly, indoor air quality, which is something that we've heard from many community-based organizations, especially in places like affordable housing. There can be some real concerns about the quality of the air in buildings. And so establishing some minimum requirements around that, we'd very much like to see, and we've provided model language for how to do that. And we're now working with jurisdictions that are in the process of putting that into their building performance standard. I have some slides here that go a little bit more into detail on site EUI and on site and district thermal greenhouse gas emissions. I think that may be a level of detail that we don't need now. One thing I will say is that normalization is important. We want to be rewarding building owners that have more activity in their buildings. If you have more people in the same amount of space. If your building is operating longer and you're adding more value, let's say you're a school, but you're staying open in the evenings for community meetings, that should be rewarded. That should not be penalized. That's one thing that the current BEPS gets right. And we'd like to see that any future BEPS keeps that kind of element in there. And that's it. Here's my contact information. I'm eager to have the discussion. It's a great group of people here. I recognize a lot of friends. So, and I want to really thank Chris for convening this. He's been a great convener all along. He was helpful, hugely valuable as we were getting the original Clean Energy DC Act passed. And especially I want to thank Andrew and Katie for their national leadership. It's just a pleasure to work with them. So I'll stop sharing.
I second your thanks to Chris. I forgot to say that, Chris. Thank you
That's
so
right.
much for convening this and inviting us to present.
No, this is really helpful. This is really helpful. And I'm glad we did it fairly early in the year. This will be good. Now, I kind of originally had scheduled maybe a 75-minute meeting, but it didn't show up in the calendar for some reason. But what other comments or questions do people have? Why don't you go ahead and raise your hand?
I'll send my slides to Chris, Laura, to answer your question. He can send them out to everybody or whoever at DCEN. I'm sure Cliff would be happy to share his too. Not to speak for you, Cliff, but just knowing you.
We ain't got nothing to hide.
Alexa called me. Sorry. So,
Nina has a
Nina,
question.
you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, fantastic presentations. Thanks all. How can buildings be rewarded for being sort of early / more eager adopters of this?
Of the trajectory approach specifically? Yeah, so when we first kind of presented this, and you all probably had the same reaction when we said, we don't think there should be an effective date till 2032. I'm sure in your brains, you think that seems kind of far out. Why are we waiting that long? And we had that conversation with the task force too, because some of the folks there were like, that seems like a ways out. Why would we wait that long? I think the reason is somewhat practical in that there's a lot of building owners that like today, I'm literally telling them, yeah, this is real. You have to do this. And they have to tell us in 2 months how they're going to comply. So it takes a while to get people to understand a policy, to understand how it works, to understand the goals, to understand that you're serious about regulating them on it. And so we really want this first compliance cycle to be that, right? We are making sure that people are meeting the requirements. They understand this isn't going anywhere. They understand that this is a thing, and it would be kind of difficult if we then amended the law and completely changed the framework of the program, and then we're going back and re-explaining that, well, what we just told you yesterday is completely different now, right? And so our thoughts were we can have this first cycle to really be thoughtful about this and do it in the right way. And then to get to your answer about early adoption, our thoughts and what we had sort of talked to the task force about is right now, our policy, our regulations allow for building owners to follow alternative compliance pathway options. And so Andrew and I have already been talking about we could potentially build out a custom alternative compliance pathway that's sort of like pre-approved by DOEE, whereas you could get on the trajectory approach in cycle 2. So let's say you're like, I want that. So it come 2027, once we set the next standard, they don't meet the standard, then they come to us and say, okay, we want to get on this trajectory approach. And we could say, sure, here you go. And like, we could sort of build that out for that building. So that was the idea that we had, is that kind of putting the actual legislative effective date of 2032, but for this next cycle, we could offer it as an option to building owners who want to do it.
Nina, I would just add that there are some precedents like Washington State where they actually have utility incentives where building owners that comply with their BEPS before the deadline for their BEPS can get some utility help. The utility won't pay all the costs, but they'll pay a portion of it. So you're rewarding building owners that are acting early there. The other thing I would just say is, certainty is really important, as we've said, and we don't have long-term certainty under the existing law. The sooner that we change the law to put in place a long-term trajectory approach, the sooner that building owners will have certainty, the sooner that they'll know that they should not be installing any gas equipment, for instance. And
Right.
we also know that building owners are reluctant to make long-term investments in long-lived assets like heat pumps without knowing exactly what they're going to have to do over the life of that asset. So the sooner that we give them long-term certainty, the sooner they're going to make major investments. That's going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's also going to improve our economy. It's going to drive investment in the economy and job creation. So even though they're talking about not having this new trajectory start until 2032, I would love to see it get introduced, in this council session.
Great news. Thanks to you both.
Does that mean that if and when we adopt the stuff, or maybe in 2030, can we retake the lead with BEPS program, with the BEPS program? Can we be the #1 city again, at least for a little while?
Yes, the answer is yes. We
All
have
about being #1.
Right. I'm no
we have healthy co-opetition. That's what we like to see is jurisdictions that are competing with each other to be best, but also helping each other to each get better. And IMT is very much in the business of catalyzing that kind of co-opetition.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've used up the hour very effectively, and it's been very helpful to me. To move all this stuff, there's so many different things that we need to be working on. We have a lot of changes, new leadership at DOEE, and new environmental leaders at the council. And it's going to take a little while to get back on track, I believe, but I'm hoping that, we all work together, and we'll be as supportive as we can of everything the agency does, that we can be prepared to deal with whatever we need to deal with. But this is an interesting moment we're in. We have a lot of work to do, and part of it is understanding what changes we need to make going forward. And you guys have done an amazing job. And again, I don't know there are many cities that could field a team like Andrew, Cliff, and Katie to to answer questions about this. So thank you. And I guess with that, I think we're gonna say goodbye and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks, y'all. Have a
Right.
good one.
Thank you.